Right, so it is day 39 of my New Year's tree planting bad idea thing. And I had put this off because I thought it was about to rain, but it seems to have passed us by this afternoon, so let's get on with it. Right, so today's planting is a couple of myrtles, and now they're from very different sides of the planet. So the first one going in is one of the bottlebrush trees. I think it's the weeping bottlebrush, I'm not sure. I'll put the Latin name up on screen because in my head it's still Melaleuca, which is now restricted to the teatrees. It is an Australian myrtle. You can see that very Australian tree in Zambia, pale growing tips. I like it primarily for its attractiveness to pollinators, but it also has a very good deep fissured bark, which is really good for rooting orchids that have been dislodged or the branches they've been on other trees have rotted and fallen off. So it should be quite a nice one for doing that on. In with that is going the standard Dracaena fragrans wild type with an aloe cameroni and an unknown succulent that forms a bush. I think it's either a very weird calico or a fairly weird curio, but whether it's either of those or related to either of those, it should be good and toxic. Should form a chemical barrier while the tree's getting established. It also does grow into a small bush, which flowers very vigorously with a lot of little yellow flowers, which should be attractive to both birds and insects, as will the tree when it's flowering. The second myrtle going in is going in for fruit, not for flowers, although it does flower quite vigorously. This is a Suriname cherry. It's also something called a Brazilian cherry and has a whole bunch of other names which I do not know off the top of my head, but Eugenia uniflora will come back to it every time. It is a very privet-like plant, so it has been planted as hedges, and we have a very long hedge of it here, but I find generally speaking the volunteers that come up of it, when they're allowed to grow, they tend to have very good fruiting compared to the original hedge, which tends to fruit very sporadically. And that's quite common with plants. It's how you form land races. The first generation you put somewhere, the ones of those that cope best will be the ones that flower and then bear fruit, and so then the seeds from those fruit that germinate will be the ones that are best suited to your habitat, and then you get more vigorous fruiting because you've got a plant slightly better settled. I'm not sure if this would apply to something like an avocado, which seems to want a bit of stress to fruit well, but it certainly seems to apply to a lot of trees. It is unfortunately, if you carry it on for too many generations, how you end up with an invasive species, so I will have to keep a watch on these, but they still very much only come up in irrigated areas. So as much as they're very tolerant once established, they don't seem to seed readily in less irrigated. So I hope that should mean that they're not going to get out of control. In with that is going another Dracaena fragrans. Now this is a different type of second generation because this is a cutting from a cutting, and with that you don't tend to get landrace, but seeing as this is a native plant anyway, it should cope perfectly well. You'll see it looks very different to the first one going in. That's because the first one going in is a cutting from one growing in sun, and the second is a cutting from one growing in shade. And they tend to retain their leaves a lot longer in shade. It's not because they're genetically very distinct, they are actually originally from the same plant, just with more levels of propagation in between. In with that is going more of the alligator plant, the Calico digramontiana, which is better known as the nightmare calico in my head these days, including one that had popped up in the pot of the little senecio going in with the bottlebrush tree, and an Aloe which in the previous rainy season the head had rotted, and so now it's got this sort of wonderful multi-head appearance, which had made it far too heavy for its original stem, so I've cut that down. That should grow back up, and then we will have two rather than just the one. But it should be fine there because that stem is nice and deep in the soil, so it should stay stable. Okay, so after that little gabble, that should be everything for today. I kind of vaguely sort of have a plan for tomorrow, but we will see.